the world of celebrities, things don't always go as planned, especially when real emotions clash with showbiz bravado. What began as a light-hearted interview on a popular talk show quickly escalated into a moment that would leave millions speechless. And it all started with a joke that went too far. Karoline Anderson had always been a fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Growing up in Sweden, she watched his films with wide eyes, cheering on his cinematic heroics in Terminator, Predator, and True Lies. So when she landed a chance to be part of the live audience during one of his guest appearances on a popular talk show in Los Angeles, she jumped at it, bringing along her husband, Johan. Unlike Karoline, Johan wasn't much of a movie buff. A reserved man with a quiet strength, Johan was a former carpenter turned engineer. He didn't have the chiseled jawline or gym-forged physique of an action hero, but he was the kind of man who showed up for his wife, for his family, and for life. During the live segment, Arnold was charming the audience with his signature mix of humor, bravado, and larger-than-life stories from his Hollywood and bodybuilding days. Karoline, seated in the second row, caught his eye. When the host pointed her out and mentioned that she was a longtime fan, Arnold smiled and waved. Then came the moment that flipped everything. The host, eager to stir things up, jokingly asked Karoline who was stronger, Arnold or her husband. Laughing nervously, she replied, "Well, my husband may not have the muscles, but he's strong in other ways." Arnold, never one to pass up a punchline, quipped, "In other ways? What, like opening jam jars?" The audience erupted in laughter, except for Johan, who sat stone-faced next to his wife. The camera panned to him, and Arnold added with a grin, "Come on, Karoline, let's be honest. I bet you do the heavy lifting at home." Another round of laughter followed, but this time it was tinged with discomfort. The joke had landed awkwardly. Karoline's face flushed. Johan stood up, not in anger, but with the quiet command of a man who had heard enough. He walked calmly to the front of the stage. The security team hesitated, sensing no threat but aware something unusual was happening. The host tried to brush it off. "Looks like we've got a challenger." But Johan didn't play along. He took the microphone. "I didn't come here for attention," he said, voice firm but composed. "I came to support my wife. I'm not a bodybuilder. I don't have a trophy shelf or millions of fans, but I've been her rock for 12 years. Through cancer, through miscarriages, through nights we didn't think we'd see the next morning. I showed up." The room fell silent. "I don't need biceps to be strong," Johan continued. "Strength isn't in how loud you can be or how hard you hit. It's in how steady you stand when life tries to knock you down." Even Arnold looked taken aback. There was no anger in Johan's tone, just truth. Unpolished, heartfelt truth. Karoline's eyes welled with tears. The audience sat frozen, no longer seeing a meme-worthy moment but something raw and real unfolding before them. Johan gently handed the mic back to the host and returned to his seat. The silence lingered, until Arnold spoke again, this time with humility. "You're right," he said. That was real strength. And I'm sorry. I didn't mean any disrespect." Applause followed, slow then swelling. After the show, Arnold approached Johan backstage and shook his hand. He thanked him for reminding everyone, including himself, what strength really looked like. The clip went viral within hours. But for Karoline and Johan, what mattered wasn't the millions of views or the headlines that read, "Arnold humbled by fan's husband." What mattered was the truth that came out on that stage. In a world where loud voices often drown out quiet strength, Johan reminded everyone, sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who doesn't need to prove it. In the days that followed, social media exploded with commentary. Some praised Johan's quiet dignity, calling him a real-life hero, while others applauded Arnold for acknowledging the moment and offering a sincere apology. Memes flooded, timelines, but so did something rarer, respect. Interview requests poured in for both Johan and Karoline, but they turned most of them down. They weren't interested in viral fame. Instead, they spent their time at home, grateful for the opportunity to remind the world of something often overlooked, that strength doesn't always come with a spotlight. Still, the impact of that moment rippled far beyond the studio. Teachers used the clip in classrooms to spark discussions about humility and respect. Therapists referenced it in sessions, citing Johann's emotional expression as a model for healthy masculinity. And among all the internet noise, one comment stood out, a simple sentence from a user on YouTube. "I grew up thinking I had to be loud to be strong. Today I learned the opposite." Karoline and Johann did eventually agree to one televised interview a few weeks later. Sitting side by side on a morning show, the host asked what went through Johann's mind as he stood up that day. Johann smiled softly. "I wasn't thinking about teaching a lesson or standing up to a movie star," he said. "I just saw my wife being embarrassed and I couldn't sit still. That's it." Karoline placed a hand on his and added, "It was the most romantic thing he's ever done. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was him. Pure and unfiltered." Arnold, to his credit, reached out again privately. He sent a handwritten letter and even invited the couple to a charity event he hosted weeks later, where he publicly recognized Johann during a speech. "There are many kinds of strength," he said, looking toward the couple in the crowd, "and sometimes we need to be reminded which ones matter most." That night, Johann stood in a room full of billionaires, influencers, and athletes, and yet to many in attendance he was the strongest man there. The world loves a good comeback story, but it's rare to see one unfold live, not with glitz and spectacle, but with raw emotion and truth. Johann didn't throw a punch, raise his voice, or demand attention. He simply showed up for the woman he loved, and in doing so he showed the world something it hadn't seen in a while. A different kind of hero. In a time when so much of our culture celebrates noise, ego, and appearance, Johann Andersen became a quiet symbol of what it means to be a man, not a movie man, but a real one. And perhaps in that silence that followed his words, we were all reminded of something we already knew deep down. True strength doesn't seek the spotlight. It just stands. Weeks after the charity event, Johann and Karoline returned to their quiet life in Gothenburg, Sweden. Their days were simple: morning walks by the river, late dinners with their daughter, and quiet evenings where not a single screen glowed in the background. The frenzy of attention had passed, and that was exactly how they wanted it. But something had shifted, not just in how others saw Johann, but in how Johann saw himself. For years, he had battled an invisible doubt, feeling like he didn't quite measure up in a world obsessed with appearances. Karoline always reassured him, but it wasn't until that moment on stage that he truly realized his worth didn't need to be defended with muscles or medals. It lived in his actions, in the life he had quietly built, in the love he gave, without fanfare. One evening, Karoline handed him a small box. Inside was a silver bracelet engraved with the words, "True strength stands quietly." He smiled, tears stinging his eyes. No award, no applause, no viral clip could match the feeling of being seen like that, fully and without condition. Meanwhile, Arnold kept in touch. The former bodybuilder was no stranger to transformation, and Johann's quiet conviction left a lasting impression. At a conference months later, Arnold told a crowd of young men, "I've won competitions, I've made millions, but the strongest man I ever met wasn't in the gym. He was sitting in the audience, standing up for love." The moment between Arnold and Johann became more than a viral clip. It became a case study in leadership seminars, a teaching moment in schools, even a sermon in churches. People weren't quoting a celebrity. They were quoting a carpenter from Sweden who said what needed to be said when it mattered most. And maybe that's the real takeaway. In a world addicted to noise, drama, and outrage, Johann didn't fight fire with fire. He didn't insult, posture, or escalate. He simply told the truth, calmly and clearly. And in doing so, he disarmed a room built for entertainment and turned it into a space for something much more powerful. Reflection. 1. Year after the incident, Johann and Karoline received a letter from a young father in Brazil. He wrote, I used to think being strong meant hiding my feelings. But after watching your moment with Arnold, I started opening up to my wife and kids. You didn't just speak for your family. You spoke for mine, too. That letter now hangs, framed in their home. To this day, Johan doesn't consider himself a hero. He doesn't watch the clip or talk about the fame it brought. When people ask about it, he shrugs with a quiet smile and says, "I just did what any man who loves his wife should do." And that's the legacy he leaves behind. Not of a viral moment, but of a message the world needed to hear. Strength isn't in the show. It's in the stand. Years passed and life, as it always does, moved forward. Karoline published a memoir 2 years later titled The Quiet Stand. It wasn't about Arnold, not really. It was about life with Johan, their love story, their struggles, their quiet victories. It became a surprise bestseller in Scandinavia, then spread globally. The final chapter, simply titled The Moment, recounted that day on the talk show not as a climax, but as a turning point. A moment when the world paused and listened. Really listened. Johan kept working as an engineer. He never saw himself as a storyteller, but sometimes he'd join Karoline at readings or community events. When asked about that famous moment, he always deflected the attention. It wasn't about being brave, he would say. It was about being honest. We've forgotten what that looks like in public. He never chased the spotlight again, but the spotlight had changed because of him. A nonprofit in Norway began hosting annual Quiet Strength Awards, honoring men and women who showed extraordinary courage through compassion, not conflict. Johan was invited to be the first recipient, but he declined, suggesting they give it to a school janitor who had stopped a bullying incident by listening to a troubled student. "That's strength," he said. "Give it to him." His humility became his signature. And in a world desperate for authenticity, his silence spoke volumes. Even years later, people still stopped Karoline and Johan in the street, not for selfies, but to say thank you. One young woman, barely holding back tears, approached them at a cafe in Copenhagen. "My father was like you," she told Johan. "He wasn't loud, but he loved my mother in the quietest, most powerful ways. I lost him last year. Watching what you did reminded me of him." Johan didn't say much. He just nodded, patted her hand, and said, "I'm honored." He sounds like the real hero, and that's the legacy he left behind. Not carved in marble, not shouted from rooftops, but etched quietly into the hearts of those who understood what he stood for. Strength isn't always about standing above others. Sometimes it's about standing with them, or for them, or in front of them when they need protecting, not with noise, but with presence. That was Johan Andersson. He never tried to be anything more than a man doing right by the woman he loved. And in doing so, he reminded the world of what real power looks like. As the years unfolded, the story of Johan Andersson faded from headlines, but never from hearts. Schools began using the story in ethics and character education. One particular curriculum module in Canada called Everyday Courage included a dramatization of that moment on stage. Students weren't tested on Johan's words. They were asked how they would respond in their own lives, in their own relationships. What would they stand for? What would they protect? Meanwhile, Karoline continued to write. Her second book, For the Men Who Stay, was a collection of letters, stories, and testimonies from women around the world, all honoring the men in their lives who didn't make grand gestures, but showed up every single day. Husbands, fathers, brothers, teachers, mentors. Many referenced Johan in their submissions. Johan kept life simple. He didn't change. He still brewed his own coffee in the morning, read by the window at night, and walked his daughter to school when the weather allowed. He kept the bracelet Karoline gave him tucked away in a small wooden box, along with a folded letter from Arnold, one he never showed anyone, even Karoline. Not because it was private, but because some things matter more when they're kept close. When their daughter, Liv, turned 16, she wrote an essay for a school contest titled, My Father, the Quiet Giant. It opened with a line that left her teacher in tears. He never asked for applause, but when he spoke, The world listened. The essay won first prize. When she showed it to Johann, he hugged her tightly and said nothing. But that night, Karoline found him sitting alone on the porch, quietly wiping his eyes. One day, long after the media storm had passed, a small TV documentary crew visited the Andersons for a reflective piece called "Where Are They Now?" Johann only agreed because they promised it would focus not on the fame, but on the message. As the cameras rolled, the interviewer asked him the question everyone always came back to. "Johann, if you could go back to that moment with Arnold, would you still stand up?" He smiled, gently weathered by time, and looked out over the backyard where Karoline was watering her plants. "Yes, but not because of what happened after. Not for the applause. Not for the internet. I'd do it again, for the same reason I did it then, because love deserves to be defended and dignity, even when threatened with a laugh, deserves a voice." He paused. "That's all I did. I gave it a voice. And maybe that's all it takes to change the world. Not everyone gets a microphone. Not everyone gets a camera crew. But everyone gets a moment to choose kindness over cruelty, love over ego, truth over silence." Johann took his moment, not to stand out, but to stand for someone, and in doing so, he gave others permission to do the same. To this day, that clip resurfaces on anniversaries and quiet Sunday mornings, and every time it does, someone sees it for the first time, and remembers that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just rises, speaks once, and sits back down. And the world is never quite the same after it does. Years drifted gently on. The world spun faster, more noise, more flash, more voices shouting to be heard. But in one corner of Sweden, nestled between birch trees and soft evening winds, Johann Andersson aged with grace. His hair turned silver, his steps slower, but his presence, still quiet, still unshakable, remained unchanged. Karoline continued to write. Liv went on to study psychology, inspired by the idea that sometimes the smallest gestures had the deepest impact. On the day she graduated, Johann handed her a small notebook. Inside were his own handwritten thoughts. Not many, but carefully, chosen. On the first page he had written, "You won't always have the words, but if you stand with love, you'll never be standing alone." She wept when she read it. When Johann turned 70, their home was filled with old friends, neighbors, and family. Not because of fame, but because of the legacy he built in the way that mattered most. Through loyalty, presence, and kindness. At the party, someone joked, "You know, Johann, you're still more famous than some politicians." He just smiled and replied, "Only because I stood up once. The rest of my life was spent sitting beside the people I love." In his final years, Johann would often sit out on the same porch where he once watched Liv play in the yard, now watching his grandchildren do the same. One day, his youngest grandson, only 7, climbed into his lap with a question. "Morfar," the boy asked, using the Swedish word for grandfather, "are you strong?" Johann paused. His hands, once calloused from carpentry, now soft with time, rested gently on the boy's shoulders. "Yes," he said, "but not because I can lift things, because I chose never to walk away when someone needed me." That night, Karoline wrote her final journal entry before bed. "He doesn't need the world to remember him forever. But I will, and so will our children, and their children, because love, once truly witnessed, never disappears. It just echoes. In how we treat each other, in how we show up, and in how we stand quietly." When Johann passed away in his sleep a few years later, there were no front-page headlines. But thousands of people, from students to strangers, from husbands to fathers, wrote tributes online. Some were long, others just a single sentence. "He reminded me to be better. He reminded me that I don't have to shout to be strong." At his funeral, Liv read a passage from Karoline's first book, one that had been highlighted and reread many times. "In a world where the loud are rewarded, he chose to be gentle. In a time when strength was measured in noise, he offered silence, full of meaning. He was never the main event, but always the reason someone found the courage to go on. They buried him under the birch tree he planted when Liv was born, and every spring when the leaves returned, Karoline would sit beneath it with her notebook, smiling at the wind that seemed to whisper, "Strength stands quietly." And through the rustling of the trees, through the quiet footsteps of children playing nearby, through the words passed on from one generation to the next, Johann still stood, not on a stage, not for applause, but in the hearts of those who had learned. Sometimes, the gentlest voices leave the loudest echoes. In the years after Johann Andersen's passing, his story became more than a tale told within his family or local community. It blossomed into a global movement, quietly yet powerfully reshaping ideas about strength, courage, and love. Inspired by Johann's example, a group of educators, activists, and artists came together to create the Quiet Strength Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to promoting emotional honesty, empathy, and resilience without the need for bravado or aggression. Workshops were held in schools from Stockholm to San Francisco, teaching young people that strength doesn't mean domination or silence of feelings, but the courage to be vulnerable and to stand for others. In communities struggling with toxic masculinity, the Quiet Strength Initiative offered new language and new models. Men learned to express their emotions, to support one another, and to redefine what it means to be strong. Stories like Johann's were shared, reminding everyone that true strength often looks like listening, showing up, and protecting those you love with gentle but unwavering conviction. Artists began creating murals, music, and theater inspired by the concept of quiet courage. In a small town in Brazil, a mural depicted Johann standing calmly with open arms, surrounded by children, elders, and families, a symbol of protection and peace. One particularly moving story came from a small village in Kenya, where a teacher named Amina incorporated Johann's story into her lessons. She noticed a transformation in the boys who had been labeled troublemakers. Through discussions about strength rooted in respect and empathy, many began to act as mentors and protectors within their community, breaking cycles of violence. On social media, a hashtag, Quiet Strength, trended regularly. People shared their personal moments, the times they chose patience over anger, kindness over cruelty, presence over distraction. It became a quiet revolution that spread across borders and cultures. Even the entertainment industry took notice. Filmmakers and writers began crafting stories that celebrated emotional bravery and everyday heroes, a sharp contrast to the traditional action hero mold that had dominated for decades. Arnold Schwarzenegger himself became an ambassador for the movement, often referencing Johann's story in speeches and interviews. "Strength is not about muscle or fame," he said. "It's about heart, integrity, and standing for what matters." Karoline and Liv were invited to speak at international conferences, sharing their family's journey and the lessons learned. Their message was simple, yet profound. You don't have to be loud to make a difference. Sometimes the quietest voices echo the longest. And so Johann Andersen's legacy lived on, not as a single moment frozen in time, but as a ripple that grew into a wave, touching lives in ways no one could have imagined. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolution starts not with a roar but with a quiet stand. Across continents and cultures, the stories kept coming. In Japan, a young man named Takashi wrote to the Quiet Strength Initiative about how Johann's story helped him reconcile with his father. For years, they had been distant, unable to express emotions in their traditional stoic way. After watching the documentary about Johann, Takashi reached out and finally shared his feelings. His father wept for the first time in decades, and a healing began. In the United States, a firefighter named Marcus shared how the movement gave him courage to admit his struggles with anxiety and PTSD. In a field known for toughness, admitting vulnerability was seen as weakness, until Johann's example showed Marcus that true strength meant asking for help. Marcus started a support group that grew into a nationwide network. In South Africa, a group of young women founded a community center named Andersen House, a safe space where people of all genders learned about empathy, respect, and emotional literacy. The center hosted workshops, art exhibits, and storytelling nights, all centered around the idea that strength is born from love, not violence. Karoline received letters daily from people who said Johann's story had changed their lives. One woman from Ireland wrote, "You showed me that standing by my husband in his quiet strength was more powerful than any grand gesture." Meanwhile, filmmakers began weaving Johann's ethos into their work. An acclaimed director in France released a film titled The Quiet Stand, a poetic exploration of a man who defies societal expectations of masculinity simply by being present and compassionate. The film won awards and sparked conversations worldwide. Schools continued integrating the quiet strength curriculum, and children learned early that expressing emotions wasn't just okay, it was heroic. Even in politics, the conversation shifted. Leaders who embraced vulnerability and authenticity gained respect and support. The phrase quiet strength became a shorthand for leadership that prioritized humanity over power. At the heart of it all, Johann's family stayed grounded. Karoline's writings continued to inspire, and Leave's work as a psychologist helped families nurture emotional courage from the inside out. One winter evening, Karoline sat with her granddaughter Elise, who was reading the first book Karoline ever wrote. "Grandma," Elise asked, "how did a quiet man like Grandpa change the world?" Karoline smiled softly. "Because sometimes it only takes one quiet voice, spoken with love, to awaken millions." And with that, the legacy of Johan Anderson, the man who stood quietly for love, passed seamlessly into the hands of a new generation ready to stand their own way. Amina's village, Kenya Amina, the teacher inspired by Johann's story, saw firsthand how teaching about emotional courage transformed her classroom. Once restless and disruptive, many boys began stepping up to support their peers, intervening in bullying situations and helping younger students. Parents noticed a shift at home too, with conversations about feelings becoming more common. The village began holding community meetings focused on empathy, breaking down long-held cultural stigmas around male vulnerability. Amina credits Johann's quiet courage with giving her the words and the courage to foster a new kind of strength. Profile 2. Marcus the firefighter. USA Marcus, battling post-traumatic stress disorder, found solace when he realized admitting vulnerability wasn't weakness. Inspired by the movement, he started the Brotherhood of Quiet Strength, a support network for first responders struggling with mental health. The group grew to hundreds nationwide, changing how firehouses approach emotional wellness. Marcus often says Johann didn't just inspire me, he saved my life by showing me it was okay to ask for help. Profile 3. Takashi and his father, Japan for decades. Takashi and his father lived parallel lives, bound by cultural expectations of stoicism. After watching Johann's story, Takashi wrote a heartfelt letter to his father. It was the first step toward breaking a silence that spanned generations. Their relationship slowly blossomed into one of openness and tenderness. Takashi now volunteers at a mental health charity, helping other men bridge emotional gaps in their families. Profile 4. Elise, Johann's granddaughter, Sweden. Elise, carrying the family legacy forward, became an advocate for youth mental health. She launched a digital platform called Quiet Voices, where teens worldwide share stories of courage, kindness, and emotional resilience. The platform has connected thousands, creating a vibrant global community built on the principles Johann lived by: presence, empathy, and standing for others. Profile 5. Anderson House, South Africa. The community center named after Johann is now a beacon of hope. Workshops teach conflict resolution through empathy, art therapy helps heal trauma, and storytelling nights foster understanding across cultural divides. Local leaders say Anderson House has been instrumental in building peace and strengthening community bonds. These stories are proof that Johann's stand wasn't a singular event, but a seed planted across the globe, growing into a forest of quiet, powerful change. In every corner of the world, people are learning that the most profound strength isn't loud or flashy. It's steadfast, compassionate, and enduring. And the world? It's becoming a little kinder, a little braver, all because one man chose to stand up quietly for love. Johan Andersson never sought fame. He never wanted to be a hero. Yet the moment he stood up quietly, with nothing but love and dignity, sparked something far greater than any spotlight could offer. His story rippled across the globe, touching lives and inspiring movements in ways he never imagined. From the classrooms of Kenya to the fire stations of America, from a small village in Japan to the bustling cities of South Africa, people found hope and courage in his example. It wasn't about muscles or medals. It was about something far simpler and far more profound: the courage to stand up for love, the courage to choose kindness over cruelty, the courage to be vulnerable and authentic in a world that often rewards noise and bravado. In the end, Johan's quiet stand became a loud call to action, not shouted from a stage but whispered in hearts and lived in everyday acts of compassion. Karoline and Liv, and now Elise, carried this torch forward, reminding new generations that strength doesn't have to roar. Sometimes strength simply stands, and when it does, the world listens.